following is a podcast episode brought to you by your friends at WSCA 106.1 FM, Portsmouth Community Radio. For more information on how you could become a member, please visit us at www.wscafm.org/support. Good afternoon, and thank you, WSCA friends and listeners, and welcome to a special programming event here at Portsmouth Community Radio. My name is Mark Lefebvre. I'm your host today, and also I'm co-host of the weekly show, Pirate Friday, with Scurvy Dog, brought to you each Friday from 1 to 5 p.m. Many of you know I'm also a person in long-term recovery from opioid or opiate addiction, and I'm a co-founder of Safe Harbor Recovery Center and a proud volunteer at SOS Recovery Center over in Dover and also up in Rochester. And I currently I run an addiction recovery consulting practice out of Hampton Falls. I'd like to thank the WSCA trustees for their support for today's program. And today we're featuring a visit by, and we're very grateful for a visit from Beth Macy, New York Times bestselling author of Factory Man and True Vine. And Beth's new book, Dope Sick, Dealers, Doctors, and the Drug Company That Addicted America, exposes the genesis of the current national opioid crisis here in America and places a big fat bullseye on one of my favorite boogeymen, Big Pharma, especially Purdue Pharma. And but we'll get to that and all of that, momentarily. First, I want to say hello and welcome to Beth. Beth, how are you?
I'm good. Thanks for having me, Mark.
And welcome to New Hampshire. Welcome to Portsmouth, and welcome to WSCA.
Great to be here.
And when I saw you driving into the parking lot, looking at all the different buildings, trying to find us here, it just reminds me of how many people feel the same way when they're kind of navigating all of the various recovery-oriented treatment and recovery options to them. I've read the book, and I got to tell you, I can't ever remember referring to a piece of nonfiction as a page-turner, but this certainly was.
Thank you.
And but I'll need to say this at the get-go, that while I read the book, I felt that as though I was kind of looking in a mirror and staring at the last 6 years of my life here in recovery, and also on the front lines of New Hampshire and southern Maine. There's a lot in common between your piece of Appalachia and what we're dealing with here in New England. Mm-hmm. I'm sure the last several weeks have been a whirlwind with the release of your latest book. How are you doing today, and how has the reception been?
The reception's been great so far. I've given a lot of interviews. I've been traveling. I was in New York, Washington, did some events in my hometown of Roanoke. Then I was up in Abington where, I write about that federal case where Purdue Pharma was, and the executives were sentenced in 2007. I was just up there on Sunday in a church that was built in 1773 giving a talk. Right from the pulpit, so that was fitting. Yeah. And Sister Beth Davies, one of the heroes of the
angels, book. One of the angels, and we're going to talk about the angels because the angels. First of all, I felt as though I knew every one of them.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
And you did a great job of characterizing them. But yes, Sister Beth, yes.
She introduced me. So she's only 4'10", so they had a little stool so that you could see her above the pulpit,
right?
Which was awesome.
Right, and all the people that that are considered angels, they're the ones that are doing all the work when the cameras go away,
right?
And the crowds disperse,
right?
And
you asked me before how this book changed me as I was working on it, and this book was so hard. It was just, and I know the pain I felt or had to absorb in order to understand these stories is just a fraction of the pain that families dealing with the situation have encountered. But honestly, the only way I could write this book and be mentally healthy, such as it was, is to, as my friend put it, to do a Mr. Rogers, to find the helpers. So I was looking for angels at every juncture of this story. And so you'll notice in the book, I write about 3 communities in particular that I think represent the arc of the epidemic as I witnessed it landing in Virginia, where I live. But I wrote the story through the people fighting back in each of those 3 communities because I thought it would help give people hope, give people some agency in the issue. And it was it was a way that I personally could stand to do it. So
Right,
I had to do what was good
well,
for me.
Well, the book
too.
needed to be written, and maybe it's divine intervention that you were the person that was selected to actually write that. And but it's going to be a very important piece of work, and we're going to look back on this as, I think, a seminal moment in the whole recovery, the treatment and recovery, and the legitimizing of this illness as indeed a disease that needs to be treated. So can you tell us a little bit about your day job, as it was prior to this book kind of taking off? I understand that you were an investigative reporter for the Roanoke Times.
Yeah. So, a city of about 250,000 people live in the valley. My hair was still dark when I arrived as a young person. I was like 25 or 26 in 1989. And I, unlike many journalists that often move on to bigger and better markets, I stayed in Roanoke and dug in my heels, and was lucky that in 2012, when heroin first started making itself known, particularly in the wealthier suburb communities, I had an editor that gave me the time to really dig in. And so that was kind of how I first came to this story.
Mm-hmm.
And then later, when I decided to do a book, I had these families and these first responders that I had been following for a number of years, and then was able to trace it back to Oxycontin landing in the coal fields of Virginia as sort of the thing that got that started.
Right. Okay. Interesting. So it kind of gave you an opportunity to put a toe in the water, if you will, in terms of getting yourself connected to the various people who were involved with this movement, but probably most importantly, to get in touch with the people who are actually, dealing with this addiction in their families.
Absolutely.
Right. So congratulations on the new book, and congratulations on Dope Sick being picked up for the television series. We were talking about this a little bit prior to this particular program. Can you tell us a little bit more about what's going on in television, how exciting that might be? You're going to be an executive producer, I understand.
Yeah, that's what they tell me. So it's been optioned by Fox 21 and Warren Littlefield companies. Mm-hmm. To be a television series. And this is all just brand new, happened last week. Yeah. And because these stories are so personal to me and I know these families so well, my first two books were optioned as well as movies, and I sort of let them go and have a world unto their own. I'm consultants on both of the projects, but not super involved. Mm-hmm. And on this one, I'm just not going to let it go. So a condition of it, me optioning it, was that I would be in the writing room and would be a part of breaking the story and figuring out which narratives we're going to focus on. And just because even if we change people's names and fictionalize parts of it, which I'm sure we will, I want to make sure that this is a gray story. It's not black and white. It's not good people versus bad people.
Sick people trying to get well.
Yeah, and I'd had some earlier conversations before I even finished the book with somebody else in Hollywood who wanted to make it the good cops versus the bad dealers, and it's just so much more complicated than good guys versus bad guys.
Right. And you've got the the whole issue of how stigmatizing this whole area can be, and you have to be careful in terms of not creating stereotypes that perpetuate those that stigmatization.
That's exactly right. Yeah. I mean, that's kind of big purpose of the book is to tell really what's going on, where the spirit meets the bone, as Lucinda Williams's poet father once said.
We were just talking about some of the musical chops we share. And so anyway, the title, Dope Sick, you mentioned the avoidance of dope sickness as a primary driver for substance use, and I'm sure many of our listeners here today can relate to that. For those who perhaps don't, maybe you can expand upon this whole context, this whole phenomenon of dope sickness and what led to the title.
Sure. I mean, plenty of people that have interviewed me that haven't yet read the book have no idea what it means. But to me, it was just a natural title. It's a little bit in your face. It's the word that users use for withdrawal, which they all describe almost to a person as the worst flu times 100. And I was like, what do you mean by that? Diarrhea, nausea, sweats, vomiting, all of it. And as one person early on in the book says, at the end of your journey, you're not doing the pills, you're not doing the heroin to get high anymore. You're just doing it not to be dope sick. And if people can just get their heads around that concept,
get
I
back
mean,
to
that would be a
normal.
great contribution, because these people are just enthralled to this
Right.
drug. They are totally, it became my God, as one person says.
Right.
That's
And
the
it's-
relationship,
Yep.
them and this drug.
And the addiction being so much stronger than the bond they have with the people that love them and that they
Yes.
love in return.
Yes.
Yeah. So,
So,
I mean,
such that
interesting-
you're willing to lose your kids and your mother and steal
interesting
from your
that you
mother.
call that out. I don't stumble into many people who grasp that concept of dope sickness unless they're either in the business or they've been involved or have experiences themselves.
Yeah. I was on Fresh Air this morning, and I've already been called out on Twitter by people going, "It's a disease. It's a choice."
Yeah.
And I'm sorry, based on all the research I've done and all the people I've talked to, it maybe it's a choice the first couple of times you do it, but it seems like very quickly after that it becomes a non-choice.
Exactly. It's a means of survival based on that whole concept of dope sickness. I've seen the great reviews, and on the tour, how has the response been? Any blowback, or you just mentioned this debate between it being a choice and it being, an illness or an...
I mean, it's only been out a few weeks, not even 2 weeks today. So 2 weeks. And no, I mean, what happened so far, I mean, I've only given like 4 lectures, but people come up and they tell me their story before and after, and my husband has this, and how's he doing? Well, they're not sure. And I lost my son. I got an email yesterday from a couple in Los Angeles, and their son had been in recovery. He relapsed. He bought some black tar heroin in California and laced with fentanyl on Craigslist. And, and they sent this, and they said, how do we get in touch with our reps? And I said, well, I know my 2 congressmen and I know my 2 senators, and if you send me an email, I'll forward it on. So please send me your story. So they write me this story about their son. And then they sent me this picture, and I'll show it to you when we're done. It was just, this kid had a twinkle in his eye.
Yeah.
And it just breaks your heart.
Yeah, it does. It
Over
really
and over
does.
you hear
It
it.
really does. Which takes me to your angels. We have many, many angels here in New Hampshire, and for the benefit of our listeners who are in the area, I want to call out a few of them if you'll indulge me. John Burns of Dover, who's a fearless advocate and founder of SOS Recovery Centers. Kerry Norton, founder of Hope on Haven Hill in Rollinsford. And Beth, Kerry, special story here. You may have seen her on the news, but she is founder of a residential program for expecting and new mothers.
Fantastic.
And Heather Blumenfeld, right here next door here at Safe Harbor Recovery Center. Andrew West, founder of Bonfire Services, who runs a men's sober living facility and is a provider of outpatient services. Ginger Ross from New Hampshire Recovery Coach Academy, who has trained hundreds of certified and prospective recovery support workers across New Hampshire. And finally, Tim Cheney, across the bridge in Maine. He's an MAT pioneer. We'll talk about MAT in a bit. And he's the founder of ENSO Recovery Centers. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about your angels and how they helped you get this story out.
Sure. So, I told you I started with this story in Roanoke in 2012, but I knew I had to write about the introduction of Oxycontin, and where that first bubbled up as a problem in America were places like Central Appalachia. So I focus on Lee County, which is Virginia's westernmost point, but at the same time it was happening there, it was also happening up in Machias, Maine, and I'm certain, among rural areas here in New Hampshire as well. And so what happened was this drug that was sort of the nuclear bomb of opioid drugs was released in 1996. I'm talking about Oxycontin. And it was said to be to bleed out over 12 hours. And this time release mechanism, which was brand new, was said to make it believed to reduce instances of abuse and addiction. And the FDA let them make this very squishy claim.
And diversion by extension.
And diversion. The FDA allowed him to say it, and then Purdue hired sales reps, fanned out all over the country. And what they did is they targeted areas like Machias, Maine, like Lee County, Virginia, that had people who worked in heavy labor industries, who had incidents of pain, work injuries, etc. And they bought data that allowed them to see which doctors in which communities were already prescribing immediate release opioids like Lortab, Vicodin, Percocet. They went to those doctors, the reps did, and they convinced them that Oxycontin was better because it was not as addictive, which wasn't true, and because of this time release mechanism. Right. And it would last 12 hours, allowing you to get the relief of uninterrupted sleep, which was great for people with cancer, end of life. But the other thing they did is working with the pain as a fifth vital sign movement that was also happening at the same time, which they largely helped fund, was they made doctors all over America comfortable with the notion that it's okay to give opioids for moderate pain. Right. So just back pain, which we all have.
I saw toothache.
Toothache, TMJ, osteoarthritis. So... And that you can even see it in their early budget reports, which I have copies of. Like, we're going to take advantage of this pain as a fifth vital sign, and we're going to make this something that doctors are not just prescribing for end of life, which they had done for a whole century. Sure. Because if you read the book, you know that we had a morphine epidemic in the late after the Civil War. And so for 100 years, we knew that opioids were only to be used, for very severe pain, end of life cancer. And then Purdue flipped that narrative.
Right. And Beth, we were just talking about angels, and you had a thought as we went to break in terms of how to expand on something that you were talking about previously.
Yeah. So I was talking about the beginning of Oxycontin in these rural areas, and the angels I focus on in that first third of the book, the people that were fighting back against Purdue Pharma, were two people. One was an activist nun. She's now in her mid-80s. She's a drug recovery coach. She works every day, like 14-hour days with people. And the other was a country doctor named Art Van Zee who helps run.
He went to the four corners of the world to get action on a lot of the things that you had written about.
He did. He testified before Congress, before the FDA, and the company basically wrote him off as a kook. In the year 2000, he wrote David Haddox, the medical director of Purdue at the time, a letter that said, "My fear is that these distressed communities are sentinel areas, much like New York and San Francisco were in the early years of HIV." He told him, he said, "I know your insert says it's non-addictive, but we have kids who I immunized as children ODing in the high school library." He was trying to get them to pay attention, and they basically just because he was a country doctor from a politically unimportant place, they wrote him off.
That's too bad. That's too bad. But he's still fighting the cause?
Are you kidding? He's 71. I was just out to his clinic a couple weeks ago. I was there with PBS NewsHour crew. They were doing a story on the book. He would only see us after 7:30. And I talked to a patient of his the other night, and they're like, "Oh, sometimes he's there till 10:30 at night." He works day and night for these patients who, otherwise they would have no health care.
Sure.
And he has an addiction practice now. He's gone he's an internist, but he's one of the first doctors in his region to become waivered to prescribe buprenorphine. And, he's seen it work. He has patients that have been on it 8-10 years, getting off of disability, which is almost unheard of, as you know, getting their kids back, getting jobs back, going back to school. He's got patients, some who are only taking like a 0.5 milligram of buprenorphine a day. But he says in his experience, they're clinging
to that last.
Well, and there's a risk that they could relapse.
Right. Well,
and then they would be opioid naive and they could die.
Right. And you can't recover if you're dead. That's the bottom line here. So
thank you.
And we'll come back to MAT in a moment, but you mentioned Purdue Pharma. That it's really, really, that's the part of the book that really made me angry. The trial and the outcome of the trial notwithstanding, the implication is that the Sackler family, who owned Purdue Pharma and who profited billions, from the opioid epidemic, got off scot-free due to the way that Purdue Pharma was structured. Can you describe kind of what was behind that?
Sure. What was behind it is Purdue hired consultant Rudy Giuliani, a name you might ring a bell.
It kind of does. It's somewhere. I can't figure it.
They hired him when his popularity was at an all-time high
Mr.
after
Mayor.
9/11. And he was supposed to thwart the government's investigation into Purdue for criminal misbranding, which he didn't entirely, but he did negotiate some sort of backroom deal with the Justice Department that allowed, instead of Purdue Pharma to be fined and to be sanctioned, its holding company, Purdue Frederick.
A shell company?
Yeah, like a shell company, Purdue Frederick, which meant that Purdue Frederick going forward was forbidden from doing business with the government with Medicaid, Medicare, TRICARE, veterans. Mm-hmm. But Purdue Pharma could still continue selling Oxycontin. And in fact, sales went up after the sentencing hearing, even though the company got a felony misbranding charge and the top 3 executives got misdemeanor charges. No one went to jail. And so Sister Beth Davies, who I was talking about earlier, who introduced me at the church the other day, 86-year-old Catholic nun who had been, begging them to take the drug off the market in the early days until it could be reformulated to be abuse resistant. She was there marching outside of the federal courthouse, holding pictures of people's dead, overdosed, dead children.
Right. So sad. So is there any accountability for the hundreds of thousands of opioid deaths that have either directly or indirectly been attributed to Big Pharma?
Well, there's a judge in Cleveland, a federal judge, Dan Polster, who is overseeing this multi-jurisdictional, all these cities and counties and states. He's trying to go for a settlement. He said if we allow...
Something along the lines of tobacco?
Something along the lines. Of course, opioids and tobacco are different because there are medical uses, legitimate uses for opioids. And but he's trying to figure out what would be meaningful contribution from not just Purdue, but the other opioid makers and these distributors and pharmacists. We had a little town in Kermit, West Virginia, 430 some people. Opioid distributor sent 9 million pills.
Say that again, 437 people in town.
Something like that. A little bit over 400 and change people, 9 million pills. And like they didn't know that was being diverted.
Yeah.
So really hopeful that a federal judge will do something meaningful with this. In terms of our Congress, you have to look at all the money that the opioid makers and distributors are putting into political campaigns and lobbying. $900 million between the years of 2006 and 2015.
Yeah. Speaking of numbers, by the way, this is a number that staggered me when I was doing some graduate work, that the United States has somewhere in the neighborhood of 4 to 4.5% of the world's population, yet we consume 88% of the world's supply of opioids.
Yeah.
That's a mind-boggling statistic.
Absolutely.
All right, so let's shift gears here a little bit. Perhaps the most difficult part of this book for me personally was the story of Tess Henry. Can you tell us about Tess?
Me too. So I have a son. He's in college now, but at the time in 2015 when I met Tess, he was a junior in high school, and his girlfriend's mother lives near Tess and her mother. Discovered their dog running loose. I didn't know the family. She returns the dog one day, and she calls me up. She says, "Beth, aren't you thinking about doing a book on heroin? I have a family that wants to talk to you." And it was but family is probably not the right word. It was a single mother, Patricia Merriman, a hospital nurse, and her 26-year-old daughter at the time, who had been a college dropout, had been working as a waitress, and was an opioid addict, had been in and out of jail, in and out of recovery, had a child, didn't know she was pregnant until she was in jail for stealing to fund her next fix. And a jailer brought her a little cup with Tylenol with codeine to keep the fetus from not going into withdrawal. And so Tess and Patricia invited me up to their home, on the beautiful home on the outskirts of the Blue Ridge Mountains, and told me their story. And then Tess invited me to follow her on her journey. She really wanted people to know how she was being let down by so many of the systems, not just Medicaid, which hadn't yet been expanded in Virginia and only was recently approved, the Medicaid expansion under the Affordable Care Act, but the mental health treatment system, well-meaning recovery coaches that sent her off to abstinence-only treatment centers, family members that were longtime members of AA and thought all Tess really needed was tough love. And she wanted me to see this kind of disaster as it was unfolding. And I really thought she was going to make it. I really did. She was a strong woman, so beautiful, so smart. She wrote poetry. She was a great reader. She was so proud of the book. I mean, she was so proud that she was part of this book that was going to help educate people.
How in the book you explained how she asked for a copy, kind of in her final days and so forth.
Yeah.
And
when the book was all finished, or I thought it was finished.
Right. Have they solved the case?
No. She was murdered on Christmas Eve. And she had been sent out to Las Vegas
this past year.
Yeah. And I then rewrote the ending of the book. But she had been sent out to Las Vegas for abstinence-only treatment center, had failed out of it, was living on the streets homeless, was living in an abandoned minivan on the outskirts of town, was living in the tunnels underneath the city where a lot of the homeless people live under Las Vegas. They call it the Wash. Was sleeping in the corners of casinos, was prostituting to get her drugs. And she really wanted to come home and get back into treatment. And she was so close. And we don't know what exactly happened, but we know she was involved in, criminal things with the drug dealing. She was middlemaning to support her habit. And she was caught up in some prostitution networks. And so we don't really know what happened to her. The police say they're investigating. But I'm worried that it's just, quote, another prostitute.
Yeah, homeless
dead.
person, cold case.
Yeah, heroin addict. Who cares?
Yeah.
That's what I'm worried. So keep her
very
in your
sad
thoughts.
Story.
Keep
and,
her in keep Tess in your thoughts. Her mother gave me, after her funeral, she gave me a locket. I've got it in my bag, actually, but it's got an E.E. Cummings poem called I Carry Your Heart in My Heart. Etched on the outside, and that was represented the way Tess felt about her son. And so I have a picture of Tess on one side with her rescue dogs, and then I have a picture of James Baldwin on the other, because Baldwin said, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced.
Right.
And I think that's just a good memory, good thought to keep me focused on what I should be focused on as I'm out talking about this book.
And I think, for me, it put a face and a life and a person's journey behind all of the reporting that you did on Big Pharma, as well as some of the efforts to get recovery resources together.
Yeah.
So
I mean, you have to show how it's all connected, because Tess didn't just get addicted to heroin one day. She was in her early 20s, she had a case of bronchitis and went to an urgent care center and was prescribed 2 30-day opioids. One was cough syrup with codeine, and the other was hydrocodone for sore throat pain. And at the end of the 30 days, I said, "How did you know you were addicted?" She said, "I Googled my symptoms." And I said, "Holy crap, I'm addicted."
Yeah, I wonder how it was swallowing those pills with that sore throat. Think about it.
But that's the whole thing. Purdue made that change so that doctors were comfortable doing that. Purdue and other opioid makers, and so that there is a big connection.
Yeah, 3:40, 20 minutes before 4 in the afternoon. We're with Beth Macy here talking about her latest book, Dope Sick. And Beth, let's maybe jump ahead a little bit. One of the chapters in the book that stood out for me was chapter 10, which was entitled Liminality. And it was particularly relevant to what we're dealing with here in New Hampshire. And I noted 3 topics in particular that I'd like to touch upon. Number 1, medication-assisted treatment, or MAT. Number 2, addiction the concept of addiction as a family disease. And number 3, the so-called liminal phase, when the individual is finally willing to seek help. So let's tackle MAT first, or medication-assisted treatment. It's very, very controversial here in New Hampshire and Maine, not among the recovery of the treatment community, but around the general public. Opponents claiming that we're really just trading one drug, whether it's methadone, Suboxone, or Vivitrol, for another. In your book, you imply your support for MAT. Is that a true statement?
Absolutely,
and why?
Because all the science, study after study, NIDA, National Institutes of Drug Abuse, every scientific body that's looked into this show better rates of recovery, by which I mean reduced overdose deaths with especially buprenorphine and methadone.
Mm-hmm. And buprenorphine being Suboxone.
Right. The generic name for Suboxone has naloxone in it too, the blocker. But I witnessed. Let's just talk about Tess since we were just talking about her. I witnessed her. I would drive her to NA meetings just as a way to keep in touch with her once a week. She needed a ride, and I would walk her baby around in the back when he got fussy. But I witnessed, even though NA said they didn't take a position on it one way or the other, when she asked to be sponsored, nobody would sponsor her because they perceived her as being unclean, in quotes, because she was substituting one drug with another. And once she lost her coverage. I mean, first of all, that felt like daggers to her.
Sure.
Second of all, once she lost her coverage after she relapsed and lost custody of her son, then she didn't have Medicaid. And then she could never get back on it in a stable way again. In Virginia, what was allowed to happen also were a lot of these cash-only Suboxone doctor practices. And that's also wrong. So I had user after user telling me that, it costs me $100 a week. They won't accept my insurance, and they give me twice as much as I need because they know I can only afford to come back if I go out and sell half.
Right.
So that's partly why law enforcement is so against it.
Sure.
But as a judge who's a friend of mine said, he said, I'm one of those climate change deniers you write about in the book. He said, I'm against it because anytime somebody in my court who's been on a lot of drug charges comes in and we allow them to go on Suboxone, they sell it to buy meth.
Sure.
And I said, fair point. I believe you. With all respect, this is observation bias. You're only seeing the cases
that come in,
the bad cases. You're not seeing the people who are getting off of disability, who are getting their kids and their jobs back. But so one of the things that happens in Tessa's story is they send her and over and over in the book. So I'd like to ask you, because you know more about recovery centers than me, why do you think so many recovery centers don't allow MAT?
Well, recovery centers, I think by and large support MAT. In fact, I volunteer at SOS over in Dover on a regular basis, and many of the individuals who are seeking help there are in fact on MAT programs.
But residential rehabs, by and large,
yes.
But the minority allow
I think
MAT.
It's a safety thing.
Sorry.
Good point. I think it's a safety issue because they've got 35, 50 other clients that are on-prem that could eventually be the recipient of some of those meds. Basically, they're trying to keep other people safe within the four walls, and it's one thing to have the individual sort of withdraw gracefully, under an MAT program, but the risk, I think, of diverting that into the general population, I think is probably one of the reasons. It may not be the only reason. Plus, I think a lot of them are based on 12-step, traditional 12-step principles. And you and I both know how the 12-step organization. By the way, speaking of 12-step, Safe Harbor, which is next door, they have the Northeast first 12-step program for MAT. It's called MAT Anonymous and MAT Recovery Anonymous, MARA. And it's a 12-step program. I've attended a couple of them, and it's just mind-boggling the degree to which these people open up when they're with people who get what they're dealing with and so forth. So very, very important work. But I think that's been my experience.
Yeah. And so most of the treatment centers that just historically developed out of to treat alcoholism, right?
Sure.
And so that may work with alcoholism, but when
you can't just drink a little bit of beer.
Right. But when you have fentanyl on the streets,
sure.
I mean, it's just...
and you can't save, you can't treat and expect recovery from a dead person. That's the fundamental issue here.
Right. John Kelly at Harvard says it takes the average opioid-addicted person 8 years in 5 to 6 treatment attempts to achieve 1 year of sobriety. Wow. That's an average.
Yeah.
So... that includes MAT and all kinds of different treatment, but that just shows you how tough enough nut it is to crack.
Sure.
And in Tessa's case, she was a user for 6 years. She didn't have 8 years.
Right.
In the era of fentanyl, which is what's driving the opioid overdose deaths
Sure, the
nationally.
mortality. Sure.
Just the new statistics in New Hampshire was up 2.2% over the year before,
Right.
and it's being driven by fentanyl. And so in this era of fentanyl, people simply don't have 8 years.
No, they don't. And the sense of urgency that you have in the halls of places like Heroin Anonymous. There's a Heroin Anonymous in this area of the state every day of the week, and which is a gift because they come in and they deal with peers who have gone through it. But you ask your when they ask for sponsors, everybody raises their hand, even if they've got a week of clean time, because unlike alcohol, there aren't a lot of people initially with 12 months, of recovery time that allowed them to be a sponsor.
Yeah.
So, so moving on to my second issue with this particular chapter, I'm referring to page 224 in the book, where members of Tess's family seem to be struggling between helping and enabling. And, with the concept of this disease being a family disease, it's not just the individual, but their family is suffering, and there are consequences for them as well. What is your view on the difference between helping and enabling, and how did it apply here with Tess's family? Apply or not apply?
Yeah, I think what happened with Tess's family is she had an older sister who was in AA, had been 6 years, doing great, and was just totally abstinence only. And so was telling the rest of the family, you saw how well I'm doing, we need to treat Tess with tough love. And so the last time she was actually with her family was the Thanksgiving of 2017, and she was home briefly. She had a big bandage on her elbow from an abscess. Everybody came in. She felt very judged. She always told me she felt like the black sheep. She made this huge Thanksgiving dinner. Her mother's not a big cook. She did all the shopping, all the preparation, and afterwards, nobody thanked her. I mean, everybody was still so ashamed. We're an upper middle class family. We have a heroin addict in our family. Why can't she get her act together? And they were going to go visit her son, who was living with the other grandmother at the time, and they had bought him Christmas gifts, and they were so looking forward to it. And she just bailed. She relapsed, and she bailed after, that treatment. And even after she died, her dad told me, whenever presented with choices, Tessie always made exactly the wrong choice. So there was no sense that, she made a wrong choice the first few times she did these drugs. But after that, she was just beholden to the spell of the morphine molecule. Right. And there was no real understanding of that. And he's an active member of Al-Anon. And I don't mean to knock these programs. They can help people.
They do.
But I just saw it sort of tear this family apart to the point where at her funeral, they're still debating tough love versus, enabling and helping, and what was the right thing to do.
What could we have done differently? Did we do too much? And it's horrible for the family.
Horrible. And I don't mean to judge them either, because I know they loved her, and I know.
Well, you can imagine.
I can just imagine
nights,
they feel terrible.
Right? How many nights her mom went to bed at night wondering if that was the night that she'd get the call.
Yeah, she went to bed with her cell phone next to her every single night.
Yeah.
Praying that she would say.
We're both parents, so we get that. You only want to do some, as much as you can. And then the third issue, with this chapter, the third thing that caught my eye was this issue, issue of liminality. And maybe you can explain a little bit what that means.
Sure. I actually had never heard that word.
I never did until I saw the chapter.
I was following.
My wife said, "Oh, limbo."
I was following the travails of this Hope Initiative program in Roanoke, which was set up by our former police chief, and the idea was to divert people from jail and into treatment.
Such as Gloucester.
Yeah, exactly, based on the Gloucester Mass program. And it was largely volunteers in Virginia. Again, we had not yet passed Medicaid, unlike in Massachusetts. And they were sending all these people when they could get them ready to go. And they said there was this moment when people had reached, this moment when they were ready, and we got to get a place for them to go. But often they couldn't.
The window is fleeting.
Yeah, the window is fleeting. But when they could do it, they were always sending them to abstinence-only rehab centers.
Right.
And so I watched one young woman who she was so ready to go, and she had been stable and on Suboxone, had lost her insurance when she turned 26 because she wasn't then covered on her dad's. And then he was going out and shopping and getting coupons and trying to get her the best. And she was actually going to a really good Suboxone provider. And this treatment facility that she ended up getting a bed for through this Hope Initiative program would allow her to be on no drugs. So her name was Joey. She was Tess's best friend, Jordan Gilbert. She was 28 years old. She started weaning herself, even though her doctor thought it was a terrible idea. She's cutting her pills in half, and then she relapses and she dies. And her family firmly believes if she had had a path forward for continuing her Suboxone, her MAT, and had had Medicaid coverage, she would be alive today. And I don't want to throw my AA friends under the bus. I have some really good friends in AA, but I was telling one of them, she's one of my best friends, I was telling her at the time about this. And she said, Beth, sometimes people die. It's their time to die. And I said, seriously, she was 28 years old. She was 28 years old. I don't think it was her time to die.
No. Wow. So, Beth, I have one more question. And have you been able to see any changes either locally or nationally since you began your journey with this book?
Sure. And I think New England has some great models. Vermont and Massachusetts, which adopted the Medicaid expansion early and have implemented these hub and spoke models such that, like MGH Hospital has a program. If you overdose at the hospital, they'll start you on MAT just as you're going into withdrawal, and then have you an appointment to come back in a day or two.
You're right. There's a handoff. Yeah,
there's a warm handoff. They've got peer recovery specialists to help look after you in the interim, and that's what it's going to take. You're already seeing their numbers start to go down a little bit. And, we've got doctors are prescribing less. Thank goodness those CDC guidelines on opioids. We're trying to go back to where we were before Purdue and painted as a fifth vital sign. But the trouble is we have 2.6 million addicted people out there, opioid addicted people. And are we just going to let them die? I mean, we've got the horses out of the barn. Even if we stop prescribing, period, we still have these people that have that should be treated as patients, not just as criminals.
Right. So true. So, Beth, you've been very gracious with your time this afternoon. I want to thank you on behalf of WSCA as well as the community for being here today and being such a passionate guest. We wish you continued good luck with your book. Please visit us at www.wscafm.org. Take care, everybody, and we will catch you on the flip side. This concludes this podcast episode brought to you by your friends at WSCA 106.1 FM, Portsmouth Community Radio. For more information, please visit us at www.wscafm.org.